Hi, I'm Kristy S. Gilbert from Loose Leaf Editorial and Production, and you have come to copy editing for immersive world building. I've been copy editing and other forms of editing, as well as designing books for over a decade now. And my favorite projects and the bulk of what I work on now are science fiction and fantasy pieces. And I'm going to teach you some ways that you can manipulate your copy editing to better help your reader immerse themselves in the world that you've built and in the minds of your characters. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. So welcome to copy editing for immersive world building. If you're here, you probably have some idea of how important world building can be to our genre. World building as a discipline has a lot of different facets to it, and it can be done in many different ways. But when I work on a book as a copy editor, my primary concern is with making sure that the book works to support the story. And SF scholar John Clute says, a well-built story world is a self-coherent venue for story. A story world needs to make sense within itself for it to function as a vehicle for story. If the world is incoherent, it's hard for a story to hang together. If an author also wants their world and their characters to envelop a reader and let them drown in the story world, setting even the little details straight can make a big difference. Some authors are so busy with their big ideas that they forget about the little ways to make the world feel more real for the reader during the story. And I mean, that's okay. You can only do so many things with your brain at a time, and writers are already doing a lot. So when copy editing, I really work hard to think about how best to help an author give the reader an immersive experience. That isn't to say I'm going to usurp what the author already has going on. The author's word is final, as far as I'm concerned, but I always do my best to make sure the author is making conscious, informed decisions. A lot of times I run into authors who don't consciously think about the ways capitalization, italics, and other typographic or copy editing elements can affect how their ideas come across. And once I've made them more aware of the different choices they've made, they make different choices. Now, I'm not going to get into all the SFF-specific copy editing decisions you can make. I'll primarily talk about capitalizing and italicizing in ways that support a good reader experience and the sorts of things an editor or author can think through when making a decision about how to treat story world elements. So our goals to keep in mind are we're focusing on the reader experience and making sure the author has the tools they need to make good decisions for their book. And these are the main principles I want you to keep in mind as we're going forward. These are my principles of immersion. So you should always treat the imaginary thing like it's a real thing. That's my primary rule. Do my best to treat everything like it's real. The more a text treats something as though it were real in terms of usage and style rules, the more naturally the audience will accept it as real. It will have the same texture as reality. If everything is marked up as odd, strange, or unique by capitals, italics, or other things that make it stand out, then the text is constantly pointing out what's weird and different instead of normalizing it. Instead, try to find a real-world parallel of that thing in front of you and follow the rules you'd apply to that. But most style rules, honestly, are kind of fuzzy and boil down to, it depends. So I also like to consider character viewpoint. If you consider the way a point of view character thinks about things, that can give you additional information about how to style something. This can help you better convey how a story world element relates to the character and how they inhabit their world. The last principle is to maintain consistency. There can be good reasons to ignore style rules, and to be honest, immersion isn't always the primary goal of every book. But sometimes if the rule is followed in some situations and ignored in others without a real rhyme or reason to it, the story world loses some of its self-coherency and it can get distracting. Additional considerations, copy editors aren't just walking encyclopedias of linguistic esoterica. We look everything up. So it's important to decide which style guide you're going to use, because that's going to determine how you treat things like real world stuff. So I use the Chicago Manual of Style, which I'm going to call CMOS for short, because that's my go-to style, and it's the foundational style for most book publishers. So if I need something that's a little nimbler or discusses more slang terms or developing language issues, then sometimes I'll go to the BuzzFeed style guide. And depending on the book, I might supplement with more niche style guides. Sometimes when I'm dealing with Earth-focused space fiction, I use the NASA style guide and use their rules for different things. Other things to consider: if a character or narrator interacts with something once in a book, mostly for flavor, and the reader's never going to see that again, probably we should de-emphasize that to make it seem more normal and also not send signals to the reader that this is something they should remember because it's going to come back again in 50 pages. On the other hand, if a character interacts with a new thing every other page for the next 500 pages, that should also be fairly normal because we're going to be seeing it so much. So all those can be data points in helping us make decisions that will help immerse the reader. Capitalization is a common point that copy editors muck with in SF, and it's almost never to capitalize more things. If I see a capitalization problem in a manuscript, it is almost always capitalizing too often. For political titles, the easiest way to deal with them is just to find the closest real-world parallel in the style guide you're using. I see a lot of fantasy novels where the kings are capital K kings in all instances, even when the viewpoint characters aren't using the title to replace a name or as part of a name, etc. If the political titles are never lowercased in the book, they should either be outrageously important or the book could maybe benefit from more of a downcap style shift. The general rule from CMOS is to lowercase titles unless they're being used as part of a name. So an example of this is in the 100,000 Kingdoms, and we have the main character Yane, who is a ruler of a small part of a larger empire, and she's called the chieftain of her people, an Enu, and also Baroness Yane Dar. This happens all within like a paragraph or so. Note that the roles she fills, chieftain, Enu, etc., are not capitalized. Only when her role is used as part of her name or full title, like when they say Baroness Yane Dar, does the political role get capitalized. This follows CMOS rules. This would also apply if someone addressed her as Enu Dar, you'd probably capitalize Enu there, or Chieftain Yane, you'd probably capitalize Chieftain as well. As with any rule, there are good reasons to have exceptions. Some fantasy worlds mix political and religious power to a degree that it makes it more appropriate to use grammar rules for deity than political position. That's why I always recommend looking for the closest possible parallel. In the Mistborn trilogy, we have the Lord Ruler, and even though he's the ruler of the known world, he functions a lot more like a deity than someone holding a political office. So it makes more sense to follow the CMOS rule 8.91, which is the rule for the names of deity rather than the names of political office. Ethnic, national, and regional people groups are usually capitalized. But when we're dealing with groups of sentient beings, a more important question than how it's being treated in the real world can be how each group is being treated within the book. This is one area where some problematic racial coding can appear in SF. So pay careful attention to it from the outset and make sure you're ready to educate your author if necessary, or if you are the author, not the editor, educate yourself on this. Species are different than races. Races are a subcategory of Earth's sentient species. Species are almost always lowercased unless they include a reference to an ethnicity, nation, region, or proper noun. A good example of this is the Mass Effect video games. They use a very downcap style. In the game, there are humans and a bunch of non-human races. It would be easy to point out how different all the non-humans are and how incredibly non-human they go around with like their jellyfish bodies by drawing attention to their names with capital letters. But that doesn't make sense. In the Mass Effect galaxy, humans are just one among many species. Humans are relatively new to the galactic stage and have less political sway than species who have been traversing the stars for generations at this point. There's no reason for humans to be default and everyone else to be capital O other. Not only would that play into frequent pitfalls SF has of othering races the main character doesn't belong to, a problem that has and continues to contribute to problematic stereotyping in the genre, but it just doesn't make sense. Humans are running around going by the name humans, which we don't capitalize. So if we treat all the alien species names the same way we treat the humans, there doesn't need to be a capital letter. It normalizes the aliens by matching real-world parallels of the alien species names. This promotes consistency within the world as well as an immersion within the character worldviews. That isn't to say that ethnicities, species, and other labels should always be lowercase. Like I said earlier, the CMOS default is to capitalize them. For example, say the humans are running around and instead of being called humans, they're called Terrans or Earthlings. Both are well broken in terms for humanity and space-related SF. And both refer to the place of origin in a way that more closely parallels country of origin labels like American, Russian, Indian, Egyptian, Chilean, etc. So if the book consistently uses place of origin in names, then capitals make way more sense. And this is what the Mass Effect alien names would look like if they were in this style, using the alien homeworlds as their names. So it would be, they'd be called Terrans and Thessians and Renakans and Palavanese and Circassians and Kajians. And all that's totally valid. I don't think it makes as much sense in this particular galaxy because everyone is so spread out and is from so many different planets that planet-based identity doesn't relate directly to species identity anymore. And so going with species names when you're talking about species makes a lot more sense. But consistency is key with this. Modern expectations and rules about how to capitalize names for groups of people are evolving. There isn't one right way to go about it, but I think it's important to make sure the book doesn't have a normal sentient being that is lowercase and an other that is capitalized to show how not normal it is, or vice versa, a capitalized one to show that we respect them and they're special, and then the lowercase one because they're like rats or something. SF has a particular history of problematically coding things racially, and a lot of that boils down to world building that happens long before copy editing, but at the copy editing stage, we can still do what we can to limit problematic elements. These basic rules apply to plants and animals too. A lot of authors initially capitalize their made-up plants and animals, but if our goal is immersion, then normalizing the plants and animals, showing them the way the characters see them, serves the purpose better. If it's just some run-of-the-mill plant that is everywhere like grass, then it probably doesn't need to be capitalized. Very few plants' common names are capitalized in the real world. Even really bonkers, bewildering ones like giant redwoods are still just like lowercase g, lowercase r, giant redwoods. A good example of this is in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives series. Almost all the plants and animals are unique to the story world. Animals we'd consider normal, like horses and chickens, are uncommon and exotic. But the story world's plants and animals serve similar functions to real-world critters. For example, chols, which are giant lobstery or crab-like things, get used like oxen. We don't capitalize ox or oxen in the real world, so chol and chols are treated similarly. Another commonplace overcapitalization is in jobs or professions. In my experience, this happens less in science fiction than it does in fantasy. My best guess explanation for that is that most science fiction jobs are more closely related to real-world jobs. Characters are technicians and pilots and politicians. So although the jobs may be in unfamiliar settings, authors are pretty good at seeing that it makes sense to present these occupations in lowercase letters. Fantasy is more likely to introduce completely different professions and roles tied to the magic systems. So again, try to find real-world analogs. If there are lots of wizards running around, chances of that job title getting used as a proper noun aren't great. Even less common jobs, like a 4-star general, are not capitalized in running text in the real world. However, if there is only one of something or the job title gets used in place of a name, then making it a proper noun makes more sense. Again, returning to Mass Effect, the character Liara Tassoni, who you can see on the screen, spends time working as an information broker. It's not a job title that gets capitalized. She's not the only one, and selling information is a common enough thing in the galaxy. But there is an information broker called the Shadow Broker, and that title is capitalized. There is only one Shadow Broker, and the job title is the Shadow Broker's name for all intents and purposes, because the Shadow Broker's identity is secret. So it makes sense to treat this as a proper capitalized noun. An exception to generally placing occupations and jobs in lowercase is when an author gives an existing word a completely new meaning, but still needs to use the pre-existing word. For example, the words folder and smelter already mean something to readers. In The Paper Magician by Charlie N. Holmberg, there are also job titles. Those are also job titles for specific disciplines of magic. Folders enchant paper, smelters enchant metal, etc. Her world still has people and devices that smelt metal mundanely, and there are bone folders and other non-magical uses for the word folder. So it makes the book more readable if the magical versions of these words are marked in some way to distinguish them from mundane uses. In this instance, quick comprehension of the difference is more important than immersion. Even though the capital letters might not fully reflect the way the words might get used in the real world, they do make it easier for readers to pick up on where the magical elements are, especially since the books in this series are relatively short, especially for fantasy novels. That ease of access was more important than immersion. Books that are longer and can spend more time drawing the reader in can usually get away with more normalized capitalization. Now, it's pretty clear I'm in favor of a general downcap style, but it's important to defer to author decisions. I prefer a downcap style because I was trained in CMOS, but there are other style guides for other organizations that go in different directions. For example, many US military-focused publications choose to capitalize words like soldier and veteran. It's not my preference, it's not CMOS's preference, as though those are occupations and roles, but these publication teams have their reasons, and I can understand them. It's realistic to also allow that inconsistencies like this might crop up in a fantasy world, although I still recommend that this leeway be used sparingly, because fiction has to make more sense than reality. An example of this, again, is in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive. Although the series as a whole trends toward a downcap style for most of the story world elements, shard bearers, warriors from the upper classes that carry magical weapons or armor, are capitalized. There are relatively few shard bearers in this story world, and they have immense political power. This brings me to my general list of acceptable capitalizations. Brand names or proper product names, that's always appropriate to capitalize. Political or professional titles when used as part of a name. Place names, proper names, and the big thing. Now, what do I mean by the big thing? Each book gets one or two, maybe more if the book is really long, big things where the normal rules don't necessarily need to apply. The more sparingly an author uses those exceptions, the more impact those exceptions will have. Shards in general are the big thing in Stormlight Archives. The characters see them as defining elements of the world's political, economic, and other systems. There are other things in the Stormlight Archives that would probably be weirder to readers if they encountered them in real life. For example, the magical critters called Spren are freaking everywhere and would be super weird for someone from our world to adjust to. But those elements are totally normalized for the characters. That's just an everyday, moment-to-moment part of their world. So when you're picking out what gets to be the big, strange thing, make sure it's from the character's perspective and not just the reader's. Another area in which authors often work too hard to point to their inventions is in italics. The capitalization rules I went over are generally pretty easy to see and resolve, but the italics take a little more work because it more often depends on the character's perspective. CMOS eliminates italics when the words are familiar enough to the intended audience of those words. However, for SF, where so much of the story world is made up and will be inherently unfamiliar to all audiences, I think it's more important to use the viewpoint character's familiarity with the thing to determine whether or not it should be italicized. Words are italicized when creators want to mark those words as foreign to the reader. It effectively signals that those are other words, not normal words. So authors can often feel compelled to italicize any words from a language they've made up. However, think particularly on two questions. Who considers the word foreign, and how often are readers going to bump into this word? If the word is old but gets used all the time, it wouldn't be capitalized. English language writers don't italicize Latin words we commonly use, even though they come from an ancient empire, sometimes even through an intervening conqueror via the French. And most of us don't speak Latin, but we don't italicize words like per se or et cetera or decimate. We just don't, because we use them all the time. We've adopted them into our language. If the book uses the word throughout and the characters are familiar with it, the italics will keep the reader one step removed from the word. Let your reader see the world the way your character sees it and normalize that word. If the word is italicized because it's foreign, take some time to think about who considers it foreign. If the scene is written from the perspective of a bilingual character, then even if that character uses words unfamiliar to other characters in the room, those words are native to that character. It creates an experience more like being in that character's head if the text reflects the character's relationship with those words. Similarly, if the word is always foreign to the reader, for example, with a language native to the story world, but native to the point of view characters, it should be treated as it would from the character's point of view. If the book uses the word throughout, it probably needs to be normalized, which means you take it out of italics. Even if it's new to the character at the beginning, you can kind of treat it like a vocabulary word in a textbook where it gets italicized when they first encounter it because it's new and weird, but as they acclimate to it, then you can drop the italics and normalize it throughout. If a character is using words that are normal to them, but new to the reader, don't italicize them. The reader will more easily slip into seeing the world through the character's eyes if they interact with the terminology of the world as if it were normal. And excessive italics are more than just a style issue when they are used to otherize a character and their language. There are many ways this can happen, but the key thing to look for is if the word is italicized simply to mark its not normalness. If that's the only reason the italics are used and they are used that way frequently, an author might want to evaluate why they want to keep that aspect of their book non-normal. This strategy is usually not immersive, and it often puts up stumbling blocks to reader-to-character empathy. It doesn't lead to books that swallow you whole and wrap you in their complexity, depth, and realistic texture. A good example of a book where the terms are italicized sometimes and not others is The Deep by Rivers Solomon. When there's a character who is encountering human language for the first time, they've been, talking with whales prior to that. And when they're learning that human language, some of the words they learn, like waj, which means song, and zoti eleyu, which means strange fish, are italicized. But that character then incorporates those words into their own lexicon and actually shares them with other people. And so Zodialeyu and Wajinru, which is a word based on Waj, are not italicized after that first encounter. We encounter the strange words, we learn what the words mean, and then they become normalized. For spells and incantations, there are a couple of things you want to consider. If there's just a magical language that the character speaks, and anything they say in that language is going to be magical, and they're essentially bilingual in that language, I wouldn't italicize it much. If you're trying to set off some sort of recitation where there's like these certain words that they say and they recite them and they're different, italics can serve a function in helping show that they've switched from speaking in regular dialogue to reciting. Like take the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. Most of us say it with the same rhythm and similar pronunciation and things like that because we were taught to recite it in school. So it's got kind of this recited feel to it, and you can communicate that with italics. You can have someone go from normal dialogue to something they're clearly reciting in a way they've been taught to recite. And another thing to consider is your audience. If your audience is young and they're generally learning and acquiring their vocabulary, it can be really helpful to let them know that you've just made up this weird language and they don't need to know what any of those words mean. And italics can be a good way of explaining that if there's a spell or an incantation that is essentially mumbo jumbo for those people, then italicize it so that they know that they can't go look it up in the dictionary. Telepathic and non-physical communications are fairly common to SF, and it's a well-established practice to place telepathic or other nonverbal or non-physical language in italics. So it's not the only way to do it. Some people still put it in quotation marks or use a different font, but it's well established and you can make really good use of it. It's fairly unobtrusive, and it also keeps a clear difference between dialogue that is interacted with the physical senses and those that happen through magical or technologically advanced means. So if you have a lot of dialogue, that there's spoken dialogue and telepathic dialogue weaving in among each other, having those set differently is helpful. So setting the telepathic dialogue in italics rather than in quotation marks can help clarify what's going on. And using a different font for telepathic dialogue is typically more distracting than it's worth when italics can be a subtle but sufficient signal. And with this, it's good to be consistent on how you're italicizing the punctuation at the beginning or end. So like this comma here at the end of quotes in my example here. I italicize anything that would be inside the quote marks in regular dialogue. Not everyone follows that same rule, but I find it very easy to stay consistent with that. And for this, the consistency is the most important part. You don't want to have like two lines of dialogue on top of each other where one has italicized punctuation and one has unitalicized punctuation. So that's what I do to keep it consistent. Author-editor collaboration. Copy editing is not, you hand it to the copy editor and the copy editor tells you everything you're doing wrong and makes you fix it. That's not how it works, and that's not really how the editor wants it to work anyway. So for authors, when you're going to work with a copy editor, whether you're working through a traditional publisher where you're probably going to have like someone you work with at the publisher and they'll hire out the copy editing generally to a freelancer, or if you're indie publishing and working directly with a copy editor, think through your choices. If you can, make sure that you've made your choices on purpose. Make a list. This is the start of what's called a style sheet. So you can spell all your characters' names correctly and capitalize things the way you want them capitalized and send that to the copy editor. And that can help them know that you have thought about these decisions and you made them on purpose. But remain open to input. Copy editors have their expertise and they want to help your book be the most awesome it can be. So listen to them, but you do get the final word. So you are the boss, which should help you be open to input. Listen to them and figure out what they want. Editors, make sure you're communicating during the project. If you see a larger issue, like don't mess around with an author's invented species and races and hand them back the manuscript without ever having talked to them. It can be helpful to reach out to authors mid-project and let them know the options and get their input. That it makes it feel more collaborative. They understand more what's going on. And brief editorial letters can be helpful even for copy edits. I know some copy editors don't do them and leave all their comments in the margins, but it can be a lot friendlier and it can be one cohesive place to put most of your feedback and lay out all the different options. In either communication set, emphasize the reader experience. If you help the author understand that a general downcap style or limited use of italics can help invite the reader in and normalize the reading experience and make everything more immersive, the author's probably going to be a lot more open to that than you just saying like, oh, you need to not capitalize this. And keep examples in your back pocket. A lot of authors don't realize the choices they're making in their books, and some of them get defensive about what they've defaulted to. And if you explain your recommendations kindly in terms of common genre goals and provide examples from that genre, then you've covered all your bases. And then whatever decision they make, you can support them in it because you know they've made it on purpose. Style sheets are important for series, but they're also important if more than one editor will work on a piece or if the editor working on it has gaps between visits to the story world. Not all books will need all these elements of a style sheet. And creating the style sheet is the copy editor's job. So authors, you don't need to make all of these. But if you've thought about how to capitalize words, how to spell them, how to italicize them in different contexts, etc., then share that info with your editor. It can be a really simple entry, but it proves that you've thought it out already, and most editors will defer to that unless it's really important or the publisher in-house style guide they're working with is really strict. So editors, you should be including spelling, capitalization, and italic treatments for story world elements and characters. Include character traits like eye color and height, or if there's like a particular thing they do all the time, put that in there. And also character relationships. Like if two people are siblings, make a note of that because you might happen upon a line where it says they're cousins because maybe in an earlier draft they were cousins, but now they're siblings. And you can catch that error for the author if you've kept track of those relationships. Keep track of author-specific style traits, like if the author uses lots of sentence fragments and it's clearly an intentional style choice, make a note of that so that the next editor doesn't try to take them all out. I also include chapter by chapter time and location stamps as well as short summaries because it helps me find continuity errors. If I run into something that seems like a continuity error, I can go back through that outline and find text a lot easier to check things. Include any words you had to look up and any rule you followed for an it depends circumstance. We're going to move to questions as soon as this recording's over. I think there's still time for it. But if I don't get to your questions during the Q&A, please reach out to me by email or on Twitter or on Instagram, and I'd be happy to talk about different issues in the realm of copy editing, science fiction, and fantasy. Thanks for coming.
Regina asks, to hyphenate or not to hyphenate? That is the question.
Oh, well, the answer is always, it depends. The end. In terms of SF specifically, then I don't know. I would need to know exactly. If you're talking about more broadly speaking, like in all fiction, hyphenation is probably the number one thing editors look up. Like I see lots of jokes from editors about like tattooing the Chicago Manual style hyphenation table on their arm so they can get it right. But there are a few different patterns. Like if you're, oh man, I don't dare recite these without looking at anything when I'm nervous because I'm talking in front of people. But you can look things up on Merriam-Webster to see if something should be hyphenated, if it should be closed, if it should be open. Like face to face, I'm pretty sure is hyphenated and eye to eye is not, or maybe eye to eye is and face to face isn't. I can't remember. I look it up because I don't know. In terms of when you're hyphenating an adjective that attaches to a noun, if it goes back and forth whether it's hyphenated, if it's before the noun, it's going to be hyphenated. If it's after the noun, it's not going to be hyphenated. And other than that, there are a few other guiding principles, but there is an entire table in the Chicago Manual style to go through all of them. I could look it up. We've got time. I can read it to you.
We've got more questions.
Okay, we'll do that then. I can read you the hyphenation table.
Okay, Impressed asks about thoughts on italicizing oh no, that's not the right one, sorry. Preferences for when to use italic for inner dialogue. What are the guidelines?
So there are no guidelines in the Chicago Manual of Style, so this is where we get to have fun. You don't need to italicize internal thought. It's not something you have to do. If you say like, blah-de-blah-de-blah, she thought, blah-de-blah-de-blah, you've already said that that's thought because you said she thought. So you don't have to have italics. I prefer italics if the thought changes person or tense. So like if the fiction is in third person, but then the thought is in first person, or if the fiction is in past tense and the thought is in present tense. I kind of like to have italics just as a visual cue for me as a reader. But I've also read books where that's not the best option. I recently read Fly Away by Kathleen Jennings. And in that book, her internal thoughts, even when it changes person or tense, are set in Roman text. There are italicized thoughts, but those are intrusive thoughts from her abusive mother that she's reciting to herself. So the story needs those italics for something else. So in that book, they don't use it. The author doesn't use it for the internal thoughts with themselves because they need that to signal when the thoughts are intrusive thoughts from mom. Also, if you have a lot of telepathic dialogue, then it might be a little confusing to have both the internal thoughts and the telepathic dialogue in italics. So my guidance on how to italicize internal thoughts or whether to do it varies depending on what else the book needs. Because basically you just need to judge how many signals you need to show difference. And if you need a lot of different signals to show difference, like we've got intrusive thoughts from mom and we've got telepathy, like, man, don't italicize your internal thoughts on top of that. That's too many things going into italics. That's going to get confusing. But if you don't need telepathic thoughts and you don't have intrusive, weird thoughts from mom, then I kind of like that signal for internal thought when it changes person or tense. but not if it doesn't change person or tense. If it's just running in with your narration, leave it alone. Let it be.
Okay, Heather asks, Kristy, how do you feel about sentences starting with but? Me and my writing group go in circles, but I like buts.
Yes, the answer is yes. You can start sentences with but. I would caution you if you're starting lots of sentences with but that I would caution you if you start lots of sentences in any particular way. Like that's just a repetitive problem. It's not a problem of starting with a conjunction. Go ahead.
Okay, Alyssa asks, I really like M dashes. Is that a problem? I know I can use commas instead, but...
So M dashes are the last bastion of punctuation, really, because you can use them for anything, basically, except like an apostrophe. So, but they do stand out a lot. They're a big punctuation mark on the page. And so it's really just a matter of finding the right balance of spice. There is food that is spicier and food that is less spicy, and both those types of food can be good, so long as you know what you're getting into. If you're spicing your fiction with M dashes, just be careful of how you do it. One of the ways that Edgar Allan Poe shows the descent into madness in Telltale Heart is using way too many exclamation points the further along in the story you get. Further the story goes, the more exclamation points you get. If you want to show someone like losing control, put more M dashes in. If you want to show someone really in control, maybe ease back on those and use like colon to show how snotty they are. So it's a matter of balance and finding the right balance for you and for your readers. So that's something that I would try to check with beta readers who are kind of your intended audience and see if you're going too far into using too many M dashes. And if you are, then just scale back a few, throw in some commas, and it'll still taste good.
All right, CJ the cat asks, what are your feelings about using a style manual for an individual manuscript or series versus Chicago manual or others? Is it appropriate to create your own style guide for your work?
Yes. When I talk about style sheets, those are essentially very specialized style manuals for a series or book. And some of those are super small and it's just character names. And for everything else, you listen to Chicago. And for others, it's like listen to Chicago, except for we're going to use lots of sentence fragments and we're going to put our verbs in the wrong way because it says something about the aliens. And so there can be lots of things. And a style sheet is essentially building your own style manual. It's just saying like the way I set up my style sheets, the top line is whatever the default is, which is normally Chicago. And I'm like, that's the default. If it's not in the style manual, look at Chicago. If it's not in the style sheet, look at the Chicago style manual. But for everything else, that style sheet is a mini style manual for that book or series. It's absolutely appropriate.
All right, Emma asks, what about a direct quote of someone's thought? Like instead of generalizing as a narrator, specifically saying what sentences they were thinking without saying she thought afterwards.
So again, it kind of depends on how you're presenting it, because if it's a third person, but it's a tight point of view and you're like in the character's head, then a lot of times those thoughts are popping into the narration, but they're not disruptive to the narration. They just flow into it. It's called free indirect thought. So I don't have an example up right now. I have examples written down somewhere. But that's why I say it's important if it's changing person or tense. If it's just if it's still in third person and past tense, even if it's what they're thinking, then I would just let it sit in the narration because it makes that narration more immersive. It makes you feel like you're deeper into the character's head. If instead you're using like a narrator character that isn't actually in the scene, which happens in like Lemony Snicket. Lemony Snicket is a narrator to the series of unfortunate events. He's not a viewpoint character. So in that instance, you probably need to set off the the internal thoughts a little bit more, and they're definitely going to be changing person and tense because the internal thoughts will switch to I, whereas Lemony Snicket is always saying she, he, they. Does that answer the question?
I hope so.
Hopefully.
We have another question.
Okay.
Where'd it go? Jay Gosling asks, if an author doesn't provide a style sheet, do you think they need one? Is it okay to ask them to make one, or is there a right or a wrong way to ask?
So I don't make authors make style sheets. I invite authors to send me a list of their character names and story world terms spelled the way they want them to be spelled, and any special requests that they have. So I invite them to do that, and I tell them that if they don't provide that, I will interpret the first instance of a character's name as the correct way to spell it. It's the editor's job to make the style sheet. And the author can help jumpstart that. And if you as the author have preferences, you should definitely state those to your editor, because your editor wants to know if you have preferences. That saves them the time of making changes that you're just going to reject anyway. Saves everybody a whole bunch of time. But if the author doesn't provide that list, I just make it, because that's my job as an editor, is to make the style sheet. Authors aren't trained to make style sheets. Editors are trained to make style sheets.
Hiram asks, what would you suggest for a character speaking in a foreign language that you translate to English that is foreign to them?
So it would be like me speaking in Japanese when I don't speak Japanese. Is that, I'm trying to understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It could be that you're everybody's speaking in a foreign language, but you, as the author, translate that to English so that you don't have long strings of foreign words that nobody can understand.
Oh yeah, that's great. I love that, because having long strings of words that nobody in the scene understands, like no one reading it understands, is awesome, because not everyone is going to learn Elvish to read your book. Sorry, it's not going to happen. I would just recommend, you can kind of flag it if the whole conversation is happening in blah-de-blah language, then you can just say the whole conversation took place in blah-de-blah language. Or like, maybe if they're just speaking in their own language and never having to speak out of that language, you don't have to flag it at all. You just have it happen. If a character is moving from one context where they're speaking language 1, and then they move into another scene where everyone is going to speak language 2, you can mention that character is transitioning from one language to the next, and then just have that conversation happen in English. It doesn't need to be set off in a weird way. That's perfect. I think this might even happen in Dune. Dune does some interesting things with the battle languages, because, like Paul speaks the Atreides battle language. So it'll just say, like, in the Atreides battle language, they said whatever they said. And then he'll hear like the Harkonnen battle language and he won't understand it. But they don't like transcribe the Harkonnen battle language into dialogue. They just say, and Paul heard a bunch of stuff in Harkonnen battle language. It sounded triumphant. And that's all you get from it, because that's basically what you can get from a language you don't speak. You can get tone.
Great. That was the right question for us. Okay.
Oh, good.
We don't have very much time left, a couple of minutes. Can you repeat your contact information, because we transitioned away from it fairly quickly?
Yes. My email is Kristy, Kristy, at looseleaf, looseleaf echo papa.com. You can also just go to looseleafep.com and go to the contact page there. My Twitter is at, I need to not do this, but it's at Kristy, SYLFAEN, Kristy Sylvain, but the Sylvain is Welsh, so that doesn't help anybody who doesn't speak Welsh. And my Instagram is at looseleafep. don't go to Facebook. It got weird and I can't access my business page anymore. So don't go find loose leaf on Facebook.
All right. Thanks so much, Kristy. That was a wonderful presentation.